Hello, everyone. My name is Garrett, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about cybersecurity and medical devices. Um, so, Connected medical devices, it's kind of a new field right now, and it goes hand in hand with the Internet of Things, which is also gaining rapid traction in society. So currently, there's about 6,500 medical devices or medical device manufacturers in operation with a market size of $133 billion. This is expected to grow rapidly with the development of IoT devices as well. So some of the benefits that come from these connected medical devices is you can increase your precision on diagnostics by having more data available. Um, and then you can also add functionality for things like remote patient monitoring, especially useful during this pandemic. And then by having all of this patient data available, you can run predictive analytics to get an idea of how certain patients will perform during the course of their treatment. And then you can have things like automated control as well. Like maybe you want to wirelessly control somebody's exercise rehab. Um, these are all very useful things that come from this connectivity of these devices. So with these benefits also come a lot of new security risks, especially with the connected portion of things. Um, so some of these attacks can result in delayed care, inaccuracies in diagnosis, disclosure of protected information, and there's been, documented attacks so far. So there's obviously things that need to change in the industry. So two of the biggest agencies that kind of regulate these medical devices in the industry are the FDA and HIPAA. So the FDA is more concerned with the actual safety of the patient, the physical well-being. Um, so they every medical device has falls into one of three classes, where class one is kind of low risk, low consequence devices like exercise bands or dental floss. Even class two is kind of the middle ground, where if one of these devices were to fail or be compromised, it would obviously have some negative effects for the patient, but potentially not life threatening. Class three, this usually involves implantable devices and things that provide vital functionality for the patient, whereas a compromise or a failure of one of these would likely result in death for the patient. HIPAA, so they primarily deal with the protecting patients' data. So their big thing is encryption from the technology side of things. So all data in a system, whether it's in transit or at rest, needs to be encrypted. So to understand kind of the vulnerabilities of a medical system, we kind of got to understand the technology stack of a typical medical device first. So usually it starts out with a sensor network, which is attached to the patient's body. And this will transmit the data it collects through a short range technology like Bluetooth Low Energy, radio frequency, or even Wi-Fi sometimes. So then a gateway, which typically takes the form of like a mobile device with a mobile application running on it, or even a local router, would receive this data, maybe do some processing or filtering, and then send it on to the cloud data center, which will then store this data. Complex systems will often run machine learning on it to, get those predictive analytics. But all of these things in communication channels open up a new attack vector for people who want to exploit these devices. So the first kind of new attack vector is the communication channel between the sensor and the gateway. And this is probably the most easily exploitable by attackers because of the limited resources of embedded devices. It's hard to implement security measures right now, at least in their current state. So another kind of attack, and this is a lot less frequent, is if there's data being stored on the gateway. an attacker could gain access to that, and if it wasn't properly encrypted, they can do whatever they want with it. So the second communication channel would be the gateway to the cloud communication channel. And this is typically a little bit harder to compromise because the gateway and the cloud are not constrained for resources. So they can implement proper encryption and authentication measures that makes it harder for attackers to access this data. Um, Another kind not involved in the communication channel is just an outright breach of the database where all this data sitting at rest could be compromised. And this is why HIPAA requires data at rest to be encrypted. So the last kind would be modifying the firmware of any one of these devices, usually the sensor device. And these, once you have your own firmware running, you can pretty much do whatever you want from there. So some of the kind of common attacks in regards to the CIA triad. So confidentiality attacks typically involve data interception executed through a man in the middle, potentially reading this confidential patient information. And this can typically be exploited on the sensor to gateway communication channel because there's usually limited encryption there. So another kind that I previously mentioned would be a cloud database breach, where a patient would have, access to these patient records that are in turn worth a lot of money on the black market. We'll talk about that later. But the next kind would be an integrity attack, and these usually are a little more consequential than the confidentiality attacks because they could lead to an inaccurate diagnosis, which would likely, result in some kind of harm to the patient if they're being treated the wrong way. The last kind, and usually the most detrimental, are availability attacks, typically carried out through a denial of service. And unlike previous DOS attacks that would just try and kind of overload a server, these usually target the limited resources of the embedded sensor and try and maybe drain the battery life or overload the functionality and kind of brick the device. Another kind of availability attack would be a firmware modification, whereas said previously, you can, once you have your own firmware on there, you can make it do nothing. You can make it exploit patient data. So that would probably be the worst kind. So some of the steps that need to be taken to ensure that the industry is headed in the right direction, because it's so young, it's very important that this happens sooner rather than later. But the overall theme of the industry right now, there's not a huge importance on security because most of these device manufacturers just want to be the first to market, and they want to do it for as cheap as possible. So that kind of needs to change, and the focus on profit needs to, kind of be shifted away from that a little bit. So a lot of these security measures kind of depend on the development of support for cryptographic tools on embedded devices. Like the current cryptographic tools are very computationally intensive, and that depletes the battery power very quickly of some of these embedded devices. So as there's improvements in lightweight cryptography, we will also probably see improvements in authentication and wireless communication protocols. And the last thing that kind of needs to happen is this will hopefully happen over time, but there's really not a whole lot of open source tools available for some of these manufacturers. And it requires a lot of them to develop these technologies in-house, which is obviously very expensive. And then, so some of the ones that do exist that are very commonly used, like Bluetooth Low Energy, contain known vulnerabilities. And these need to be addressed quickly because so many of these devices use Bluetooth Low Energy. So if an exploit is found, I mean, it almost serves as a universal exploit into a lot of these systems. So it's hopeful that the industry will kind of shift in this direction, and medical devices will continue to transform healthcare.